Hi everyone and welcome. We're outside my yard, and if you've been watching my channel you'll recognize that this is my outdoor worm bin as we begin to enter the winter months, and it's my first try at trying to keep worms outdoors. So I'm a little bit hesitant, I'm a little bit nervous, I'm unsure of some of the specifics of how to do this. So it's only been about 3 days since we last checked in on this bin, but I did receive feedback from my viewers last time we peeked in here, and I liked some of the ideas that were given, so we're going to tend to this a little bit. But my main reason for shooting a video today was to talk about night crawlers, and obviously this bin has night crawlers in it, but it's only got a small portion of my night crawler population in it. This bin was populated with worms that originally inhabited my one of my time-lapse bins. It was a time-lapse that I shot of worms hatching out of cocoons or eggs, and those cocoons were stored in a pretty small little container and shot a time-lapse of them actually hatching out of their cocoons and eventually growing into larger size worms. Not that large, but still growing into mature worms and making their way through their environment, their habitat. And eventually, once that time lapse concluded, I went ahead and I released some of those night crawlers into this bin. And they're also occupying space in here with some red wigglers as well. So the types of night crawlers that I have out here in my outdoor bin are European night crawlers. And the feedback I received about this container was that I may have placed these hunks of pumpkin a little bit too high up. So the idea here was to try to I'm trying to figure out the best way to accomplish this, was to actually get the pumpkin down lower, which is where the worms are hanging out, and then use all the remaining leaf matter as insulation over the top of all that. So it's a little bit awkward because there is a fair amount of leaves in here, but basically all I'm trying to do is shove the leaves off to the side, and then make sure that the pumpkin is down as low as possible, so that the worms, who are actually down low, we'll see if we can get a glimpse of some of them. So here we can see some worms hanging out, and I could feel the material is pretty chilly because last night was another cool night. We went down into the 20s, and so here we can see some more worms hanging out. We did go down into the 20s last night, and tonight again it's going to go down into the 20s. So I wanted to take some of the precautionary measures that a few people had made recommendations for me to do in the comments of the last video I posted about these guys. And part of it was to move this pumpkin down lower for them to gain easier access to it. And as long as we're going to be down here, I figured I would also maybe, add a little bit of coffee grounds. So that's my container full of coffee grounds. So I thought that maybe it would make good sense to add to their existing food supply by throwing in some coffee too, in the hopes that maybe I don't have to worry about feeding them too much going forward into the winter. So I'll just throw a little bit more coffee down here, and then all of this leafy matter on top will also serve as food for them too. But I also wanted the leaves on top to also serve as a I can see some worms hanging out here, so I must have pulled some of them up as I was picking through. So if it's too cold for them up here, I'm sure they're going to work their way down to where they, find that it's a little bit more comfortable, hopefully. So besides putting the coffee grounds in here, I also wanted to just pile in a whole bunch more leaves, and that was the other reason I wanted to add more food, was because getting access to these worms down low will just become that much more difficult once all these extra leaves have been added into the container. So the whole idea being insulation, is to give them a little bit of protection from the oncoming cold. Hopefully the house radiates enough warmth to protect the bin a little bit in the really cold weather. But a lot of people have suggested that the worms will huddle together and sort of form a big massive ball, and they'll be able to guard against the cold by being in a little sort of a worm ball huddled up against each other. So I just wanted to see what I could do about, you know, trying to further protect this container from the cold. You might also notice, if you watched the previous video that I created about these worms in this bin a few weeks, actually a couple days ago, I've also shoved leaves in around this cardboard that was put in here for insulation too. So this was really what I had intended to do, to hopefully protect these worms from the oncoming cold, and I guess we'll see how that goes. But further discussion about my nightcrawler population will continue downstairs in my wormery, because other than the European nightcrawlers that I have down in here, I've also got some African nightcrawlers downstairs in my wormery, as well as more European nightcrawlers too. So we're going to go check in on them next. The initial launch of worms, when I originally created that outdoor worm bin, was utilizing only the worms that came out of these two left chambers in this time-lapse bin. So if you've not seen my time-lapse showing each of these three compartments here, hatching red wiggler cocoons, European nightcrawler cocoons, and African nightcrawler cocoons, I'll put a link to it up here in the corner. There you can check out this nursery time-lapse showing this bin set up originally with only cocoons, and eventually, you know, the baby worms hatching from their cocoons and occupying the space and composting the material within the bin. But it was the worms that inhabited these left two chambers that were used to populate the outdoor worm bin. And like I said, red wigglers and European nightcrawlers, but the European nightcrawlers that I had over here were not the only nightcrawlers, not the only European nightcrawlers that I had. If you look over here, this label that you see on the container on this VermiBag Mini says ENC, and that's European nightcrawlers. The European nightcrawlers that inhabit this container are not the ones out of the time-lapse bin. Those were hatched from cocoons as well, but I had a quantity of what was supposed to be 500 cocoons of the European nightcrawlers, and those I had originally launched off in this green container here, a little tiny pail. And when it started to seem like the space was becoming a bit cramped, I upgraded them to a slightly larger container. So they continued to grow and thrive in here. And eventually I decided it was time to move them into a full-size bin. And my European nightcrawlers that were launched on the 26th of May, and as of today, it's 200 days. And that's the other reason I wanted to shoot a quick video about my nightcrawlers, is because the oldest bin that I've ever had was 199 days. And now that I've got bins that are exceeding 200 days, I figured I would just sort of draw some attention to it. And it's obviously not the same, because my 199-day-old bin that was launched with, you know, a couple pounds of red wigglers certainly had the capability of going through an entire bin full of compostable matter and creating a nice big tub full of finished vermicompost within, you know, those 200 days. But, you know, if you think about it, 200 days ago these things were still just crawling out of their cocoons, and they were still tiny little baby worms. They were obviously not launched into a new container in the sheer numbers as I launch red wiggler bins normally. So even though it's been 200 days, they kind of had a little bit of a disadvantage based on the fact that they were just newborns and there were significantly fewer of them. So even though it's been 200 days, I'm certainly not expecting to see those types of results quite yet. So I believe that the stuff in this bin is really just finally starting to pick up some momentum with the European nightcrawlers. So what we're going to do is we're going to grab some food to give these guys, and we're going to take a peek at how they're doing. So now down here within the European nightcrawlers VermiBag, we've got Some night crawlers hanging out right beneath the paper and the feeding zone indicator, which is my coffee filter. I did come into these night crawler bins a couple days ago, or maybe it was yesterday, and I did use my spray bottle to try to moisten up the material, because that's the one thing that I've come to realize with these fabric bags, is that they're terrific for aeration and ventilation, but I do find it a little bit more difficult to keep the material in the bins nice and moist, which is what the worms like. So this stuff feels pretty good. Here and there on the very edges it seems a little bit dry still. So right now I'm really just aiming to supplement the food that they got about a week ago, just to see how things look, and then you know, maybe another day or two I'll come back in here with the spray bottle again and apply a little bit more moisture. But for now it's really just a quick check-in on how the previous feedings are holding up. Corn, a couple hunks of corn, which are very slow composting items. You hear me say it every time I encounter the corn in my bins. It's a little bit frustrating if you didn't know what's going on. I remember the first time I tried composting corn, it just seemed like it was taking forever, and it did take forever. But in time the worms get through it, and then it becomes compost just like everything else. Just need to be a little bit patient with it. Some of these older food items that they received at the previous feeding, which was a week ago today, 7 days, are still present. So you can still see remnants of the previous feeding. Here's some more banana peel. So I'm not going to go crazy feeding this bin today, I think, because I do see some leftovers from the last time they were fed. So we'll just add a little bit more food in addition to this existing food that's already being worked on. And we'll cover this thing up and let these little guys get back to work. So here I have some, this is a hard roll that was getting a little bit moldy. Didn't dare eat it at that point since I saw some green growing on it, so I figured it would become good worm food. I'm throwing a little bit of coffee on top of that, a little bit of eggshell, maybe a lot of eggshell, and I guess we'll go ahead and we'll give them another banana peel, some of this leafy stuff. Not even sure what this is. I think it might be coral rob. The leaves of the coral rob. So to me that seems like enough, because like I said, there's, you know, leftovers here from the previous feedings which they're still working through. We've got some larger chunks of food from previous feedings, such as these corn cobs. So we'll just go ahead and move some of these older food bits that they've been working on for some time now back in here on top of the fresh food that they were just given. So this is where we stand so far with my my European nightcrawlers that were hatched out of the 500 cocoons, and that's in addition to the European nightcrawlers that co-inhabit the outdoor worm bin with my red wigglers. This looks like a piece of potato, maybe? I'm not sure what it is. Maybe it was a potato. Although if it was a potato, I think it would smell really foul, so I'm not sure what that is. But whatever. I kind of shredded it at this point, so I'm sure we won't be able to make any sense of what that is in the future. So just kind of level things off here and get it covered up. Try to push some of these food particles down low. Let these European nightcrawlers get back to work. So that's where my nightcrawlers, my European nightcrawlers, stand now that they're 200 days old. All right, let's cover this thing up and move on to the African nightcrawlers. So last but not least, we have the African nightcrawlers. And you'll remember, this takes us back to the time-lapse bin. The African nightcrawlers were hatched out of this chamber of this this see-through bin, and you can see it's a very small space that they were originally hatched in. And as they start to grow in size, they too were placed into one of those pink pots that I showed earlier. And nowadays, they inhabit this VermiBag tote. And here too you can see ANC African Nightcrawlers with the same May 26th date, which was 200 days ago. So let's go ahead and give these guys a feeding and see how they're doing. So like we did with the VermiBag Mini that has the European Nightcrawlers, I came in here too with the squeeze bottle or squirt bottle and applied some moisture, because the same as the VermiBag Mini, this VermiBag tote is also of that same fabric material, which is very very well ventilated and does great in the more humid months, but in the drier winter months I'm just finding it a little bit difficult to keep things nice and moist and comfortable. So I want to make sure that my African Nightcrawlers also have enough moisture to remain comfortable. And it's always kind of cool when I first crack open the African Nightcrawler container, because they are larger than the whatchamacallits, the red wigglers that I'm used to composting with. So it's always a little bit of like an immediate shock to me of the size of the first few worms that I glimpse when I first open the bin, before my mind registers and I come to the realization that I'm dealing with African Nightcrawlers, not red wigglers. These are nice big fat worms, definitely larger than the red wigglers that I'm used to composting with. So I'm just checking them out. I really still haven't had a lot of opportunity to handle Nightcrawlers much, because it's only been 200 days since I've had them. And in the very beginning they were really just cocoons, they weren't even worms yet. And even back then, after they started hatching, they were still like little tiny nothings. They're finally starting to get to the size that they should be. And I did actually notice during one of my feedings not too long ago that I had a couple Nightcrawlers that were kind of latched onto each other, and they were mating. So when you see two when you see two worms kind of linked together, they're mating. And it was kind of cool because that day I had just opened up the container, took off the paper, and there right on the surface was a couple worms getting frisky with each other. So I'm just picking through here, trying to get a sense of what some of this older food was that they received previously, but I really don't remember. Not that it's that important, I'm just curious. Try to get a sense of how things are progressing. Seems like they're doing a pretty good job. So now, a little bit different though, when I launched the European Nightcrawlers in the other VermiBag, in the VermiBag Mini, I did start that population with 500 cocoons. And this population of African Nightcrawlers stems back to only 100 cocoons out of the time-lapse bin. Although I believe somebody even made reference to that when I've talked about it in the past. Somebody said something that suggested that an African Nightcrawler cocoon could hatch a significantly larger number of worms than a cocoon from some other species. So even though I only started with 100 cocoons with these guys, and I started with 500 cocoons of the European Nightcrawlers, somehow it seemed to me that there might actually be almost an equivalent number of African Nightcrawlers as there are European Nightcrawlers, even though they originally started from a far fewer number of cocoons. So trying to move things aside here a little bit to make some space for this next feeding. Also just trying to get a sense of how things are looking and check out the worms while I'm at it. I definitely think things are looking pretty good in here, actually. Can't complain. Maybe I'm just kind of, having high hopes here that my my night crawlers are at the stage where they can be reproducing, and I'm wondering if this is a cocoon. And if it is, then it's pretty far along, because worm cocoons start out very light in color, look like almost little tiny green plants or something like that. But this, if it is a cocoon, it's pretty far along, because it'll get darker and darker in color up until the point where it's ready to hatch. But I really don't know, and I don't want to squeeze it or disrupt it. I just wanted to take a closer look since I noticed something that might be a cocoon. And that's kind of weird for me, because I normally don't really spot cocoons when I'm in my bins. It just happened to be sitting there, and it looked a little bit like it might be a cocoon, so I figured I'd check it out. But I would think that after 200 days, I would think that these worms are probably at the age that they're, capable of reproducing. Because I guess, I think the indicator is that if the worm has that bulge on his body, that little clitellum, that's the indicator that the worm has reached breeding age, maturity, so that maybe there's actually cocoons starting to get laid in here, and maybe the next generation of night crawlers are already on their way to being hatched in my wormery. And that would be pretty cool. I wouldn't complain. Alright, let's go ahead and get the feeding to these guys as well. We're going to do the same as we did with the European night crawlers. The European night crawlers got a chopped up roll. This is the other half of that same roll. I wanted to divide it up evenly between the two bins. And we'll not go overboard here either, because it seems like there are some scraps from the previous feeding, but we'll give them a banana peel and some greens, a couple more of these things that look like they're maybe Carl Rob or whatever they are. I'm not sure what they are. But I think that's adequate. We don't need to go overboard on feeding these guys. We'll just get the old food back down in here. Let's also give them a little bit of grit, because that always helps, right? And you know what? Almost forgot. Here's some coffee too. Let's get the coffee in here as well. And then they'll be really happy. Now they got a whole bunch of food. This stuff's already developing some mold, which is also something that the worms should really enjoy. So I'm going to start piling things back onto the feeding zone here down the middle. But while I'm at it, I'm going to take a little glimpse off on the outer edges, because down where the food is in the middle, that's where you're going to find the majority of the moisture as the frozen foods thaw out and the worms work it down and whatnot. But out here on the edges, it's going to be a little bit drier, as I've seen. So when I come back in here with the water bottle and I give these bins a little bit of moistening, I want to know where the knead is. And it does seem like the knead is going to be out on these outer edges to keep things moist and comfortable for these little guys. Alright, so that's my night crawlers, and that's 200 days from cocoons to where we stand now. And I feel like both bins are doing quite nicely, and we've got some pretty nice size worms doing quite well. I'm really looking forward to, seeing their numbers grow and have, enough to really have them pile into a feeding zone, and then I can harvest their castings and then, launch a fresh new bin with actually, a whole bunch of mature, large night crawlers. So yeah, but this will take time, since they did start in small numbers and they started as hatchlings. So I'm not sure how much longer it's going to take. My guess is maybe another couple months before a batch like this is really nearing the possibility of harvesting. So patience. I've got time. I'm not in a hurry, and it is kind of cool, watching worms go from the very smallest stage of their lives, from cocoons to hatching and growing and finally getting to the point where they're mature and multiplying. So it's kind of interesting to watch it from the full life cycle perspective. So, all right, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. I'll go ahead and I'll put things away here and clean up, but that's not fun. I'll leave it at that. So that's it for today. If you enjoyed the video, then as always, please remember to leave me a quick thumbs up just to show that you liked the video, and consider subscribing to the channel, and maybe even ring the bell to get notifications of new content coming online. Alright everyone, thanks for keeping me company, and hopefully we'll see you back here next time. Take care, bye now.